So, thank you for joining us for this segment. We're going to be talking about the efficiency gap and how it's calculated, and also about some other measures as well of gerrymandering. We have Nicholas Stephanopoulos, who is a professor at the University of Chicago, joining us, and I'm going to let him introduce himself further.
Great, thank you very much. So as you said, I'm a law professor at the University of Chicago, where I write about election law, constitutional law, voting rights, sort of a set of public law related areas. And I've been involved in the current conversation about redistricting in a couple different capacities. So as an academic, I've written a number of articles about redistricting. And then I've also been one of the lawyers who brought the Wisconsin and the North Carolina partisan gerrymandering cases, which are the only two federal cases to result in maps being struck down on partisan gerrymandering grounds in the last 30 years or so. And so I'm happy to talk about both my academic perspective and also my perspective as a litigator in this area.
Great. So thank you. I wanted to start off with just a general description of what the efficiency gap is. And I know people use terminology like wasted votes, right? But really to just give a general overview of the efficiency gap and how it's calculated.
Sure. So the efficiency gap is a quantitative measure of partisan gerrymandering that's meant to capture all of the cracking and packing that go into a district plan. So any partisan gerrymander is accomplished using those two techniques of cracking and packing. Cracking means dispersing the other side's voters among many districts where their preferred candidates consistently lose by relatively narrow margins. And packing refers to over-concentrating the other side's voters in a small number of districts where their preferred candidates consistently win by enormous margins. And so both cracking and packing produce what political scientists call wasted votes. These are votes that don't contribute directly to electing a candidate. So in the case of cracking, all of the votes that are cast for the losing candidate are wasted because the candidate doesn't win. In the case of packing, all of the votes that are cast for the winning candidate above the 50% plus one threshold that you need for victory are wasted as well. And then the efficiency gap is just one side's total wasted votes over all of the districts in a map, minus the other side's total wasted votes, divided by the number of votes that are cast in the election. And so it tells you in a single number which side is disproportionately benefiting or being victimized by cracking and packing, and how big that party's advantage or disadvantage is.
Great. So I think the other thing that really resonates for me is that the efficiency gap is a relatively new way of measuring gerrymandering, and specifically partisan gerrymandering. And I was wondering, what are the differences between measuring it this way and the other methods of measuring it?
Sure. So before the efficiency gap came along, there was another measure of gerrymandering that political scientists often used called partisan bias. And the Supreme Court also addressed partisan bias briefly in a 2006 decision. Partisan bias asks, if you had a hypothetical, perfectly tied election in a state, how different would the parties' seat shares be in that environment where their vote shares are both exactly equal at 50%? And the reason that courts didn't adopt partisan bias is that they were concerned that this hypothetical perfectly tied election might be too speculative. If you take a relatively safe state, it's really hard to imagine what would happen in Massachusetts or Utah if you suddenly had a perfectly tied election. And so the efficiency gap that I talked about is designed to solve that problem with partisan bias. Unlike partisan bias, the efficiency gap does not rely on a counterfactual election. It only looks at the cracking and packing, the wasted votes that occurred in the real election that we observed. And so that's why the efficiency gap is, in my view at least, an advance over the earlier measure that political scientists had been using.
Great. I think another piece is, can you use the efficiency gap to only measure partisan gerrymandering, or is it an effective way of just measuring, because there's issues with racial gerrymandering as well, for example. Can it be generalized in that way, or is it specifically about just partisan gerrymandering?
Yeah, so it is basically just a measure of partisan gerrymandering. You're right to point out that redistricting raises all sorts of other issues beyond partisan manipulation. There's racial gerrymandering. Some people are very concerned about districts that look funny or that don't follow town or county boundaries. Some people really care about competitive districts. And no single metric can possibly capture all these different values that we care about in redistricting. And the efficiency gap doesn't try. It's a measure of partisan advantage, partisan skew. It doesn't purport to be measuring any of the other values that we care about in redistricting.
Great. That's a good point. So I think finally, one of the things I read, so I was doing a little bit of research ahead of having this conversation with you, is that you noted that you can only use the efficiency gap analysis to you can't use it alone, actually, to challenge districts. Like, it has to be used in concert with some other conditions. And it'd be great if you could talk to what are those other contributing factors that enable you to make the argument for, to use the efficiency gap to make arguments about partisan gerrymandering.
Yeah, sure. So the reason why a large efficiency gap or a large score on any of these metrics can't be enough legally to strike down a district map is that there's a lot more we want to know about a map before striking it down than the fact that it really benefits one side or another. And so our legal test has the additional components of partisan intent. So was a map drawn with the goal of helping one party or another? Durability of partisan effect. So even if we have a large efficiency gap, are we confident that the efficiency gap would stay large even if the electoral environment shifts a bit in the state? And then there's also a justification part to the analysis. So how do we know that the political geography of the state or other legitimate redistricting goals aren't what explain the large efficiency gap? The way we analyze that typically is by producing lots of alternative maps for the state that have equal performance on all of the nonpartisan goals of the jurisdiction. And then we compare the efficiency gaps of those randomly generated maps with the efficiency gap of the actual plan. And if there's a big gulf between the two, then we can confidently say that the large efficiency gap that we observe is the product of partisan intent, and it's not the result of some neutral factor like geography or the Voting Rights Act or something like that. And so it's only when you have that conjunction of factors, deliberate gerrymandering, severe gerrymandering as measured by the efficiency gap, persistent gerrymandering, and unjustified gerrymandering, that I think that courts can be sufficiently confident to strike down a map. And so that clearly means that the efficiency gap by itself and any single metric standing by itself is not going to be the entirety of the legal approach, at least.
Great. Thanks for that explanation. And I just wanted to open it up here really quickly. Are there any other points or thoughts that we didn't cover already that you think might be of interest to the learners in this segment?
Yeah, maybe I'd mention just, what sorts of efficiency gaps have we actually seen recently? Like, what do the trends look like in the efficiency gap?
Mm-hmm.
And I'd say a couple of things about that. One is that the sizes of the efficiency gaps that we've observed in the current decade are the largest in about half a century. So we have the most severe gerrymandering right now across the United States that we've seen since before the 1960s. We also have the most pro-Republican efficiency gaps of the last half century. So for a long time, Democrats were the ones who were really the masters of gerrymandering. But since roughly the 90s, there's been a steady movement in a Republican direction. And the current plans are the most pro-Republican that we've seen in years. So that's just a little background on, we have this metric. What does this metric tell us about district maps in the country today?
Wonderful. So thank you very much for your time today, Professor Stephanopoulos. And please join us for the next segment, and we look forward to continuing this discussion about gerrymandering.
Sure. Thank you for having me.